People keep asking the same question. Where is the silver supply? They've been asking it for years, decades, actually. And that single question has quietly misled almost everyone watching the silver market. Because the real story was never about when supply would arrive. It was about why it was never meant to arrive in the first place. For over 25 years, investors waited for a shortage that never officially showed up. Mines kept producing, refineries kept running. Silver never disappeared, yet somehow it never truly reached the open market in a way that could reset prices. That wasn't an accident, it was a structure. Silver didn't vanish, it was locked. The illusion of waiting. In the late 1990s, silver was treated as an afterthought. Gold got the headlines, oil got the power. Silver was labeled boring, abundant, and most importantly, replaceable. Analysts said supply would always catch up. Mining executives reassured markets that higher prices would unlock more production. Investors were told to be patient, so they waited. But while everyone was watching mine output charts and reserve estimates, something far more important was happening quietly in the background. Silver was being rerouted, not hoarded in secret vaults, not removed from the earth, but redirected into systems that never had to release it back. This is where the story stops being about geology and starts being about contracts. When supply stopped being free. Historically, silver flowed through open channels. Miners sold to refiners. Refiners sold into spot markets. Price discovery happened in public. That system began to change in the 1990s. Industrial buyers, electronics manufacturers, defense suppliers, chemical processors started demanding something new, certainty. They didn't want to compete with investors. They didn't want volatile prices. They wanted guaranteed access at predictable costs for decades. So long-term agreements replaced open market exposure. Silver was no longer just sold, it was assigned. Multi-year supply contracts locked in future production before it ever reached exchanges. Leasing arrangements allowed bullion banks to promise silver they didn't physically hold, because they assumed it would always be there later. This worked as long as nobody demanded delivery all at once, and for a long time nobody did. Paper replaced metal. As physical silver quietly moved into long-term industrial channels, something else filled the gap. Paper, futures contracts, unallocated accounts, ETFs backed by complex custodial structures, synthetic exposure that gave the appearance of abundance. On paper, silver was everywhere. Trillions of ounces changed hands digitally without moving a single bar. This created a dangerous illusion that supply was endless, liquid, and instantly accessible. But paper silver doesn't require new mining. It doesn't require delivery. It only requires confidence that someone else will never ask for the real thing. For over 2 decades, that confidence held. Prices stayed calm, volatility stayed muted, and investors were told there was no real shortage. Meanwhile, physical silver was leaving the free market and not coming back. The lockdown nobody announced. This wasn't a conspiracy meeting. There was no single decision. It was a slow lock. Industrial demand grew every year, but instead of bidding prices higher, it absorbed supply through private channels. Electronics used silver because nothing replaced it. Medical technology used it because it was irreplaceable. Defense systems relied on it because failure wasn't an option. Later, energy systems joined in. Solar panels didn't just increase demand, they changed who controlled the metal. Governments subsidized solar expansion. Manufacturers secured forward contracts. Silver moved directly from refineries into panels that would never be recycled for decades. Once installed, that silver was effectively gone. Not destroyed, just unreachable. This is why waiting for mine supply missed the point. The metal wasn't missing, access to it was. Why prices didn't react. Normally, rising demand causes rising prices. That's the rule investors trust. But silver broke that rule because price discovery was no longer tied to physical flow. Paper markets absorbed pressure, leasing mass tightness. ETFs satisfied investors without requiring widespread delivery. As long as confidence remained, price stayed controlled. And confidence is powerful, until it isn't. For 25 years, the system worked because demand was fragmented and patient. That patience is now eroding. The quiet consequence. Here's the part that almost nobody calculated. Silver isn't consumed like oil. It isn't destroyed like food. But it is dispersed. Tiny amounts spread across billions of devices, embedded in infrastructure designed to last generations. Recovery becomes uneconomical. Recycling becomes theoretical. So while paper markets assumed future availability, the physical reality moved in the opposite direction. The longer the lockdown lasted, the harder it became to reverse. The mistake everyone made. Investors kept waiting for a visible shortage, empty shelves, failed deliveries, exploding premiums. But the system wasn't designed to fail loudly. It was designed to delay recognition. The real error wasn't ignoring silver, it was waiting for supply that had already been spoken for. What made the system so effective wasn't secrecy. It was normalization. By the early 2000s, silver leasing had become routine. Central banks, bullion banks, and large financial institutions treated physical silver not as a finite asset, but as a circulating balance. Metal was lent, sold, promised again, and recorded as if it still existed in the same place. On balance sheets, it did. In reality, it didn't. Leased silver rarely returned. It moved downstream into industrial use, into manufactured goods, into infrastructure that would never be melted down again. Yet accounting rules allowed it to remain counted as if it were still available. This is where availability and existence quietly split. The leasing loop. Silver leasing worked on a simple assumption. Future supply would always refill the pool. A bullion bank could borrow silver at a low rate, sell it into the market, and invest the proceeds elsewhere. When the lease matured, the bank would simply replace the metal with newly mined silver. That replacement never fully happened. Mining output grew slowly. Industrial demand grew faster. But the system rolled leases forward, assuming tomorrow would solve what today postponed. It was a rollover economy. As long as contracts renewed and deliveries were deferred, no alarm was triggered. The structure didn't need extra metal, it needed compliance. And for years, compliance was easy. Derivatives replaced delivery. Futures markets were designed to hedge price risk, not replace physical trade. But over time, they did exactly that. Most contracts never resulted in delivery. They were closed, rolled, or settled in cash. This allowed massive volumes to trade without stressing physical inventories. To the market, liquidity looked deep. To reality, it wasn't. Hope and interest expanded far beyond what warehouse stocks could ever cover. Yet because settlement rarely required metal, the mismatch stayed invisible. This became the backbone of price stability. Not because silver was abundant, but because delivery was optional. ETFs and the comfort of exposure. When silver ETFs launched, they were marketed as a bridge between investors and physical metal. In practice, they became a buffer. Investors gained price exposure without demanding bars. Custodians managed complex chains of responsibility. Authorized participants handled creation and redemption, often without triggering large physical movements. This satisfied demand without releasing control. For the system, ETFs were perfect. They absorbed investor interest while keeping the underlying structure intact. The price signal was muted by design. At no point did the system require anyone to lie. It only required everyone to behave as expected. Investors preferred convenience. Institutions preferred predictability. Industrial buyers preferred certainty. So price signals that should have screamed stayed quiet. Silver demand rose year after year, but the market treated it as manageable because the mechanisms of delay were working. This is why traditional supply and demand models failed. They assumed free flow. There wasn't any. When available didn't mean accessible. By the 2010s, the word available had lost its meaning. Metal listed in inventories wasn't necessarily deliverable. Metal counted as reserves wasn't necessarily retrievable. Metal promised through contracts wasn't necessarily replaceable. But the market didn't ask those questions, because asking them would have forced a reset, and resets are disruptive. The system's blind spot. Every controlled system has one weakness: time. Long-term contracts lock supply, leases defer repayment, derivatives postpone settlement. But physical reality doesn't roll over. Silver locked into electronics, solar arrays, and defense systems does not return on schedule. It does not respond to price incentives. It does not care about futures curves. It just stays where it is. The longer the structure operated, the tighter it became. Why the last few years feel different? Something subtle changed, not in production numbers, not in official statements, but in behavior. Industrial buyers stopped relying on spot markets. Refiners prioritized strategic clients. Premiums began separating from paper prices. These weren't signals of panic, they were signs of preparation. When access matters more than price, systems shift quietly. The cost of waiting. For 25 years, investors were told to wait for supply. What they weren't told was that supply was already committed, long before it reached public markets. The market didn't misjudge silver's value, it misjudged its availability. For a long time, the silver market looked deceptively calm. Charts moved sideways. Supply reports showed consistency. Inventories appeared stable enough to reassure institutions. To most observers, this stability suggested balance, but stability can be misleading. In complex supply systems, stability is often the final stage before rigidity sets in. When a market stops responding naturally to changes in demand and price, it does not mean the system is healthy. It often means the system has become constrained in ways that price signals can no longer correct. Silver entered that phase quietly. Stability as a warning signal. In functioning commodity markets, volatility is a feature, not a flaw. Price fluctuations signal scarcity, abundance, and shifting priorities. They force producers and consumers to adapt. Silver's unusual price behavior over the last 2 decades told a different story. Demand rose steadily, Yet prices struggled to reflect that pressure. Industrial consumption expanded into electronics, medical technology, communications, defense systems, and energy infrastructure. Each sector required silver not as an optional input, but as a functional necessity. Still, the market behaved as if supply could always adjust. This disconnect was not random, it was structural. Why silver could not respond like other commodities? The fundamental problem lay in how silver is produced. Unlike gold, silver is rarely mined on its own. The majority of global silver production comes as a secondary output from mining operations focused on copper, lead, and zinc. This makes silver supply inherently inflexible. When silver prices rise, mining companies do not immediately increase silver output. Their production decisions depend on the economics of entirely different metals. Even when silver prices justify expansion, developing new capacity requires years of exploration, permitting, financing, and construction. As a result, silver lacks a responsive supply curve. Demand can rise sharply, prices can signal urgency, but production remains largely unchanged. This reality quietly undermined the market's ability to self-correct, the false comfort of paper abundance. While physical supply became increasingly rigid, financial markets created an illusion of flexibility. Futures contracts, unallocated accounts, and synthetic exposure allowed massive volumes of silver to trade without requiring physical delivery. This expanded liquidity on screens while leaving the physical system untouched. To investors, silver appeared abundant. To the physical market, it was anything but. Paper instruments did not introduce new metal into circulation. They merely redistributed claims on existing supply. As long as most participants settled financially rather than demanding delivery, the system functioned smoothly. This arrangement worked not because silver was plentiful, but because confidence remained intact. Confidence became the real lubricant. Leasing and the vanishing return flow. Silver leasing played a critical role in reinforcing this illusion. Leased silver entered the market as supply was sold, consumed, or embedded into products, yet continued to be counted as if it still existed in reserve. Accounting conventions allowed metal that had physically left circulation to remain visible on balance sheets. Over time, this created a widening gap between recorded availability and physical reality. Leases were rolled forward rather than settled. Obligations were deferred rather than fulfilled. The system assumed that future production would replace past consumption. That replacement never fully occurred. Silver moved downstream into uses that did not return metal to the market on any meaningful timeline. Electronics, infrastructure, and energy systems absorbed silver permanently. The return flow slowed. Then it stopped mattering altogether. Dispersion. The lock. No one noticed. Silver's true lockdown did not occur through hoarding. It occurred through dispersion. Tiny quantities of silver were spread across billions of products worldwide. Each device contained only fractions of an ounce, but collectively, these fractions added up to enormous volumes of metal. Once dispersed, silver became economically immobile. Recovering it required dismantling complex products, separating materials and processing them at costs that often exceeded the value of the recovered metal. Even at higher prices, recycling struggled to keep pace with consumption. This created a one-directional flow. Silver entered systems designed for longevity. It exited circulation for decades. This was not destruction. It was permanent displacement. Why recycling never became the solution? Recycling is often presented as a natural response to rising prices. In theory, higher prices should incentivize recovery and bring metal back into the market. In practice, silver recycling faced structural limits. Modern products are optimized for performance, not recovery. Silver is used sparingly but critically, bonded to materials that are difficult to separate. Collection systems remain fragmented, and processing infrastructure lags far behind consumption. Even when recycling rates improve, they address only a fraction of ongoing demand. Recycling did not fail because of lack of effort. It failed because silver was designed into systems that resist retrieval, the shift from price to access. As physical constraints accumulated, behavior changed quietly. Industrial buyers stopped relying on spot markets. They moved upstream, securing long-term relationships with refiners and producers. Price became secondary to certainty. Refiners began allocating output strategically rather than competitively. Predictable demand was favored over marginally higher bids. Governments did not publicly label silver as strategic, but they treated it as such. Silver became embedded within broader resource planning, energy policy, and defense logistics. These shifts did not reflect panic. They reflected recognition. When access becomes more valuable than price, markets stop operating on open competition and begin operating on prioritization. That transition marked the true completion of the lockdown. Why the market still struggles to price this reality? Acknowledging structural lockup forces uncomfortable conclusions. It challenges traditional pricing models. It questions the reliability of paper exposure. It reframes silver as infrastructure rather than inventory. Markets resist such shifts because they destabilize long-standing assumptions. As a result, analysis remains focused on surface-level indicators, production figures, reported inventories, short-term demand cycles. The deeper constraint remains largely unaddressed because it lacks a dramatic trigger. This is not denial, it is institutional inertia. The quiet cost of time. Time compounded the problem. Every year, silver remained embedded in long-lived systems, the less responsive supply became. Infrastructure delayed return cycles. Energy systems extended replacement timelines. Industrial products stretched recovery horizons far beyond market expectations. Physical dispersion does not self-correct. It accumulates. With each passing year, reversing the structure became harder, not easier. The final misunderstanding. For years, investors waited for an obvious signal, a headline shortage, a delivery failure, a public acknowledgement. But the system was never designed to fail visibly. Supply did not vanish. It became committed to uses that do not respond to speculation, committed to systems built for continuity, not release, committed to structures that value reliability over flexibility. The market did not underestimate silver's importance. It underestimated how completely silver had been absorbed. Closing reflection. Silver did not break economic rules. Those rules were applied to a market that had quietly changed. For more than a generation, silver circulated financially while becoming fixed physically. The longer that process continued, the harder it became to reverse. The greatest mistake was not waiting. The mistake was believing supply was still waiting too.